Ori Schwartz, welcome to Digital Markets Research Hub. It's a great opportunity to ask a couple of questions, and I wanted to start with this conversation by maybe asking you, as a member of OECD, we all know its prominent role in shaping economic parameters and ideas for, let's say, Western democratic countries, or let's say liberal democratic countries, or maybe broader. But who knows better than you the mission, the objectives, and the main milestones and KPIs of OECD? And because some part of the audience are students, so maybe it would be helpful for us to refresh our minds with this broader encyclopedic question, so to say.
So thank you very, very much for having me. Very, very happy to be here. And not just trying to avoid your question. Now to your question. Sorry. So the OECD is an intergovernmental organization. It has currently 38 member countries. It's currently going under accession process with several countries, so it might be even bigger soon. And it's focused on policies. The OECD's motto is better policies for better life. And indeed, this is exactly what it does. It's being run by its members. His members are the owners of the organization. And the OECD, the organization, is headed by the Secretary General of the OECD. And the OECD works within different areas of, let's say, everything that has to do with the economy, social issues. And it works through committees. So you have different committees that are focused on different substantive areas. So you have a committee on education, you have a committee on health, will have a committee on corporate governance and on investment policy and on trade policy and on competition. And in each committee, you will have representatives from the member countries and sometimes from additional countries and from other IOs that will meet together to discuss these policy areas on which they are responsible, and with the support of the Secretariat. One of the, perhaps if I may, it's of course describing everything that the OECD does will take a lot of time, but if I can highlight just one feature of the OECD, which I find to be one of the best, let's say, is the horizontality. The fact that the OECD can provide a very wide perspective and can also address the linkage between different policy areas. So just to demonstrate, last week we had the meeting of the competition committee. You were there, and we had a session on competition and privacy. Doing competition and privacy is a very, very, very timely topic, as you know, and you can see a lot of things happening on this in many different fora. But the unique perspective that the OECD can provide is due to the fact that in the OECD, we have a working party which is focused on data protection and privacy. And the session last week was a joint one with them. So it was not just competition people talking about the link between competition and privacy. It was competition people and privacy people talking together about better policies and how to better address the challenges of the interplay between competition and privacy. So this is, say, in a nutshell, the OECD.
And let us zoom in, perhaps. And you are the head of the OECD Competition Division. We all in academic cycles, and I imagine also in policy aspects of competition law and economics, we all receive such a huge, massive of knowledge, processed, updated, refined, examined scrupulously by your part of your division. So it offers to us invaluable, for students as well, invaluable source of information, etc. But maybe you can also highlight the architecture or the institutional setting, how you work, what are the main criteria of performance, etc.
Sure. So maybe just to provide a bit of an overview of what we're doing. So the competition division is part of the Directorate for Financial and Enterprise Affairs in the OECD. And it basically serves the OECD Competition Committee. which, as I mentioned earlier, it is composed of the competition authority, mainly of competition authorities of member countries and additional countries. So we can maybe describe what we're doing, divide what we're doing into three pillars. First is to serve the committee. So to make sure that the meetings are organized, that the material is there on time, to prepare background notes, to set the stage for the conversation that will take place in the committee, which meets twice a year. The second thing that we do is to disseminate. The committee develops knowledge and develop instruments, legal instruments, best practices. And it's up to us to disseminate them in OECD countries, but also in other countries. And third, it's about capacity building and trainings of competition authorities, and not only competition authorities, mainly also policymakers, also other authorities on competition issues. So again, this is very, very broadly. We take a lot of pride. You mentioned the papers that we produce, and we take a lot of pride on them. We have a very we put a lot of effort into them, and it's always good to know that they are appreciated. And we always, just to say, they are all available online, and we always appreciate very much feedback, positive feedback, but also constructive criticism about the work that we do that will allow us to do better.
And if you look at, you mentioned 30 plus countries, which is a huge gathering of more or less like-minded people as far as first order things concern. But in terms of, we all understand that when you do competition policy, there is 101 way to do the same policy, and thus it's and your priorities might be shaped by myriad of different factors, and the order in which you see these factors influencing you and your jurisdiction. So you witness continuously a constructive dialogue, let's say, constructive multilogue between different member countries. What are your reflections? Do you see that OECD offers this fruitful forum for searching for consensus, or it's not about consensus? How do you see this process overall?
Well, I think it's a very good question. So, and I will divide my answer into two. So first, when decisions are being made, the OECD is indeed a consensus-based organization. So, for example, if we need to adopt an instrument, a best practice can be adopted only if only if all members agree to that. And in this sense, you need to get a consensus. And of course, as you, I think, rightfully noted, in many areas, not all, but in many areas of competition policy and enforcement, there is much more than one way to do something. But I would dare say today, perhaps more than compared to the past, there is also much more convergence. And this is part of our mission. I mean, again, part of the wider OECD scheme, the sub-part of the wider OECD vision, that to see the open global economy, converging competition regimes have a lot to contribute to that. So in this sense, pushing for convergence, when convergence is possible, is something that we put a lot of emphasis in. And this consensus building process sometimes can be complicated. As you know, there are in certain instances, there are fundamental differences between different countries in terms of their competition regime, but in others, there is a lot of convergence. So it depends. And just let me, again, provide an example. The committee decided last week to review its merger recommendation, the recommendation on merger control. And again, merger review, if you look at the current recommendation, which is from 2005, it's very general. It's focused mostly on procedure. And to be honest, it's a bit out of date. When this recommendation was issued almost 20 years ago, it made a lot of sense. Because back then there was a huge question mark over the mere existence of merger control. And to basically just providing the statement, which is maybe taken for granted today, that merger control is part of competition, is an integral part of competition law, it had a lot of value then. But things have evolved, and now we need, and the ability to reach a consensus over deeper, wider areas is present, we believe, also on substantive analysis of matter. So we will try, hopefully successfully, to push in this direction. Going back to your question, the second part of my answer would be that having a forum in which you can freely exchange views and ideas, not necessarily in the purpose of reaching an agreement or an understanding, just hearing from your peers across the globe about the challenges that they are facing and about the solution that they are considering can be very useful. So in this sense, just having this arena when opinions can be exchanged is very useful.
You mentioned that there are topics which where you see disagreement between different stakeholders or different countries, and there are others where you see consensus, but or more or less on some incremental marginal issues there are some disagreement, but the general view is pretty much identical. Can you maybe provide to us some reference to the issues which are currently which receive priority of the competition divisions in 2024, let's say?
Sure. So I can mention several of them, and I'm not sure you will not be shocked. So first, digital markets are and have been for quite some time now a priority area for us. We've been working on that. We've been a pioneer. The OECD has been a pioneer of working on the competition challenges in digital markets. So much so that several years ago, we issued a compendium that basically we call it the digital handbook that assembled everything that we've done or compiled everything that we've done until this point in time on digital markets. From that point on, we did even more. And this continues to be a priority for us. Just to give a sense, we've been working with the G7 countries on digital markets. We now, with this new wave of ex-ante regulation of digital markets, DMA type of regulation, we've prepared an inventory when we analyze the different regulations, the different reforms that took place or that are being considered, and we update this inventory once a year for the G7 meeting. So this is digital. Second, I would say that there have been several topics that have been coming and going to our meetings: sustainability, competition and sustainability, kind of the role that competition authorities, the competition policy, that competition enforcement can or should not take place within the green transition. And I would say that the third is probably AI, the rising star of competition, other rising star in general, but certainly the rising star of competition policy. Again, just to give a sense, last week in the committee meeting, we had a very thorough and long session on competition AI, which was accompanied by a background paper we produced. And later, the same day, we had a discussion in the committee, which we always have, which is about future topics, what the committee will do in 6 months, in a year. And we came with several proposals, as we usually do. And I must confess, we have not included AI as a proposal, as a secretariat proposal, because we thought, well, we just had a conversation on AI, but there was consensus, going to a better consensus in the room. There was consensus in the room that we should do even more on AI. So as we serve our members, this is what we'll do. But just to give you a sense how strong is the interest that competition authorities currently have on this issue.
And in this regard, not necessarily with AI exclusively, but more generally, what are your reflections about this recent trend? Not that recent, actually. Time runs quickly. Of their pressurizing competition policy, making it less hermetically sealed and being more open, more interactive with other broader societal goals. I imagine in the previous modality, where the right answer was kind of discoverable through the lens, if we apply proper toolkit of of economics, there was kind of maybe illusion or maybe very difficult, very hardly discoverable truth about the nature of markets. Whereas now it's a little bit less clear, more fragmented. How do you see these processes? Is it does this new reality make your work more difficult, more more hectic, less predictable, more spontaneous? How do you try, and what's the mission? Do you want to systematize the relationship of competition policy with other policies, or just describe the reality or propose some solutions?
Well, I think first it's much more interesting, but this is beside the point. I think it's much more relevant because when you think about policy decisions are always made when taking into account several point of views. And again, I think this is one of the points of strength of the OECD, the fact that we have the experts on other areas in the house with us. So when you want to have a better, for you as a competition person, we like to have a better understanding of point of view and the interest of other policy areas. We can provide that. Of course, it also goes the other way around. So when it gives us the opportunity to contribute the competition perspective into other policy areas. And again, let me provide an example on this. We have colleagues in our directorate. Our director is called DAF, the Director of Enterprise and Financial Affairs, who are doing mostly corporate governance. And they have one of the areas on which they're working is SOE, stand-alone enterprises. And they have a very esteemed instrument recommendations, guidelines on SOEs, on the corporate governance of SOEs. Now, as we know, stand-alone enterprises, it is an interesting, very relevant topic in competition law. So when they revised their guidelines on SOE, they gave us the opportunity, which we were very happy to take, to comment and contribute the competitive perspective on this topic. And now that you have the final guidelines, it has a very strong competition angle. So it's not about competition, but it has the competition point of view, which again, promote the dialogue between these two policy areas. And I think both are benefiting from this because you have a better corporate governance rule for SOEs. And at the same time, we make it easier for our members from competition authorities to insert their point of view into these areas. So I think if anything, it's a very positive development in my view.
Do you see, as a follow-on question, Ori, do you see that this process, this let's say interdisciplinary dialogue between or intersection dialogue between competition and other other important societal values, is there any way for us to systematize or describe, or everything is ad hoc and everything is context dependent and each jurisdiction has its own vision, or there are some topology, some core which can be try to describe and systematize?
Again, I think that today things are much more systematic in terms of understanding the interplay between competition, between different policy areas in general, especially with respect to competition. I think if you go decades, competition authorities were very much siloed. They saw themselves mainly as enforcers. As enforcers, they enforce the law. They do not discuss policy with other branches of government. And with time, they realized that so much more can be done in terms of promoting competition with the dialogue rather than the silo. I think one of the phenomena that you saw in this sense is the rise of advocacy, of understanding the importance of delivering or explaining your policy, your point of view to other parts of government, and doing so not with the stick, but with the carrot. So letting others understand what they can benefit from competition, but also at the same time, it's not a one-way street. Also understanding that, well, with due respect to competition, there are other priorities, there are other policies, and when you think about policies, you need always think about prioritization. And yes, as a competition people, you think of how to promote your agenda up the scale, but at the same time, you need to realize that the environment in which you are working is much more complicated. There are other interests that need to be considered. So again, in this sense, I would say it's much more realistic, and it has much more impact.
And then another follow-up question, follow-up question, if I may. So we know that independence of competition agencies was a topic, a very sensitive topic, and the position was pretty much consensual 20 years ago, that the more independence, the better. All these societal issues blur the clarity and create this background noise, which is impossible to decode. And then you have these policy recommendations, which destroy our neutrality of fine-tuning the market competition in markets. And now we see that, as you explained very clearly, that the reality is changing, and we become more mindful of interdependent, of myriad of interdependencies between different sectors of our societal life. Do you observe, witnessing, communicating with heads of competition agencies and senior officials of competition agencies, members of OECD, that they are also mindful on pure sociological, socio-legal perspective? They are also mindful of this changing mission of competition authorities, and they are more open to this communication with government, maybe. And does it raise maybe some problems also in terms of how to calibrate these dialogues?
Well, I think that generally speaking, yes, you see a much better understanding and let's say deeper willingness to consider and to kind of to encompass the complexity of the policy work. I wouldn't necessarily connect it to the issue of independence, because this understanding is usually achieved through dialogue and not through arms, not through one side trying to impose its views on the others. So in terms of independence, I do not see a shift. I do think, I mean, and I've mentioned earlier that the role that competition plays in the green transition with issues of sustainability and so on, and it's would have been very difficult to even think about these topics without seeing the bigger picture, right? I mean, green transition is a priority area for government, and for competition authorities to take an active role, and by the way, not all of them do, many of them, but not all. But for those who take an active role in this process, they, by doing so, they indicate that they see the bigger picture, that they need to have a contribution to this process, and they think, how can we be more useful in this sense? So yeah, I see it happens. I think generally speaking, it's a very positive trend.
Yeah, indeed. When talking about independence, I should be clear that not so we've gained independence in order to become a meaningful member of this or participant of this dialogue. Exactly. So I mainly refer to independence of thinking rather than some influence from the government directly. Yeah, but that's a very good clarification. An issue which concerns many is the relationship between competition and something which until recently was seen as a kind of taboo or a faux pas, something which is not very, polite even to mention, industrial policy. We see a significant shift in our understanding of their coexistence and mutual influence. The OECD again plays the leading role in helping to the stakeholder, to the community of competition people to understand and comprehend, and maybe to try to play with these two terms more actively, let's say. What are the latest developments in this field?
Well, as you know very well, we had again a discussion in the competition committee last week on competition and industrial policy, the interplay between the two. And well, first is what maybe the most significant change is that industrial policy is back. And for now, it seems that it's stronger than ever and is here to stay. And given that this was not a decision made by competition authorities. This was a decision made by governments. And the question that we try to look into is whether, considering that industrial policy, or at least some level of industrial policy, is here to stay, how can competition policy can support a better industrial policy, a more pro-competitive industrial policy? Because we say industrial policy, but there is much more to it than just the title. Industrial policy can do some very positive and some very negative things from an economic perspective. And once a decision is made to promote industrial policy, then competition policymakers or competition authorities can be there to support, to advise to their governments on how to frame, how to structure industrial policy in a way which is not only less anti-competitive, but even pro-competitive. So to push governments to think in terms of, for example, not picking winners, but picking the game, picking the tournament, and investing in the tournament, and then let's see who will win, rather than investing in a winner which is decided in advance. So this is just one example on how competition policymakers can be part of this conversation, and it seems that this is a theme that goes along our conversation now. How competition policymakers can take part, an active part in this conversation, and potentially influence it in a way which will, at the end of the day, create a more pro-competitive industrial policy.
And what were your first reflections about the atmosphere in the room? Did you notice polarity of views, or maybe divergence of views? How distant the endpoints in the discussions were?
I was actually surprised to see one of the, maybe I should have mentioned it earlier, one of the things that we do in the OECD is that when we have what we call a roundtable on a topic, we use the word roundtable. And we use the word roundtable for a reason, because it's not a conference type of conversation when you have experts talking to an audience. It's indeed a roundtable. You will usually have experts talking to the audience, but then the audience will speak. And in front of the roundtable, participants are welcome to send contributions. So to send their perspective of the topic which is being discussed. And you, by the way, can find these contributions on our website. So not only can you find the Secretariat kind of view and paper on the topic, but you can find different countries' views and experiences on this topic. And I was going back to your question on the industrial policy, I was surprised to see, I must say surprised for the good, for the better, to see that many, more than I expected, more jurisdictions than I expected, competition authorities are taking an increasingly active part in this conversation and are able to achieve, I would say, to influence the bottom line in a very positive way.
And follow up on the digital, because digital is one of several, I imagine, fields where competition and industrial policy interact. Does it play the pivotal, the central role in the discussion, or it's something rather on the margins?
I think, I mean, I wouldn't say on the margins, but definitely it's one angle, it's one topic where one area when you have this intersection, but it is certainly not the only one. Just again, the green transition, the role that government are playing in the green transition is also one very, very central part of the conversation, with governments trying to provide, for example, subsidies to accelerate green solutions. Then, yeah, so I would say yes, digital is part of the conversation, but there are many more to it.
And when we look at the OECD Competition Division and its core collaboration with other international organizations. The first example which pops up is International Competition Network. What are your relationship? Do you, because it looks that they do, the ambition there to do similar issues and the mission. So do you cooperate? You share information? What are the compartment, how say, complement each other in different aspects?
Okay, sir, we have very strong and positive relationship and collaboration with the ICN, and this is definitely a priority for us to maintain this very positive relationship. And there are, of course, some serious overlap in the membership, because I would dare say that all 38 OECD countries, their competition authorities are also ICN members. So the overlap in membership is not complete. No, it's not full, because non-OECD competition authorities are not necessarily part of the OECD, but there is a very, very strong collaborative relationship. We participate regularly in ICN events, and again, the kind of the atmosphere is very positive. In terms of the differences or the different perspective that we have. So first, the OECD is an organization of governments, whereas the ICN is an organization of competition authorities. Of course, there are consequences to this difference. For example, when you have an OECD best practice approved, an OECD recommendation, this is not just a recommendation of, it does not only represent the perspective of the competition authority, it represents a commitment by government. So it makes it much more policy oriented, and it presents a deeper commitment to this policy. The other side, of course, in the ICN, things can be done maybe more quickly, because in terms of it's only the competition authorities with the membership, and once you reach an understanding between the members, then basically that's it. In terms of the work that we do, I would say, again, there is some overlap. There is OECD work is generally considered to be sometimes more policy oriented, directed more at heads of authorities, let's say, or other policymakers who are doing competition or thinking about competition, whereas ICN work tends to be more technical, aimed at the kind of the case handler plus level, kind of the nitty-gritty issues of the day-to-day activities of competition authorities. We sometimes do joint work, for example, on international cooperation and enforcement. I think it was 2021 or 2022, we had a joint report that we drafted together on international cooperation in competition enforcement. And I hope it's okay if I'll quote the chair of the ICN steering committee, Andreas Mundt, also the president of the Bundeskartellamt, who said that whenever we cooperate, it works for the best. So my understanding of this, and I cannot agree more, is that we should cooperate more frequently, and indeed this is something that we aim to do.
And in the spirit of cooperation, we know that OECD, the allure is that it is a robust intergovernmental organization with all this kind of flavor of public mission and mandate and the entourage. But also you engage with civic society, with other organizations, non-governmental organizations. Can you elaborate a little bit on your collaboration with this aspect of our society?
So yes, we have usually, I can start maybe with international organization. We do have in our committee participation from other IOs. So we have UNCTAD, the UN agency, which is focused on competition and consumer protection, and they actively and frequently join our meetings. We have in the committee coordinators that are responsible for coordinating the activities of the OECD on competition with the activities of the ICN and UNCTAD. So again, to show you that these organizations, we see ourselves as working for the same cause, and hence the cooperation is very, very useful. We have representation typically from the World Trade Organization and from the World IP Organization, and so on. Again, understanding that having a broad perspective will usually result in better outcomes. Also, in the OECD, you have what is called BIAC, which is an institutional part of the OECD, which is responsible for representing businesses. They usually attend our meeting and provide very, very useful contributions. Obviously, participation by private sector can go very well in some discussions, not necessarily in all of them. Sometimes competition authorities, which are our delegates, would like to have confidential discussions, again, dependent on the type of the conversation that we're having. But in general, I would say that, again, we believe that having the widest perspective possible typically leads to better outcomes. And we try to practice that in our day-to-day work.
And, you know, in academic cycles, we often hear from our administration, from our management, that it's given that you have your publications, but what about the impact? What about the your research being picked by some policymakers, and you show us the relevance? So in most of OECD countries, you would definitely see a significant part of academics who compete for attention by OECD. And I imagine you while preparing all these helpful materials, the people who are drafting these papers, they scan, scrutinize a significant portion of texts published by academics. And each situation is unique, etc. But maybe you can suggest some recommendations to academics, how to make their papers, their research and their profile more visible by OECD Competition Division.
Well, as you rightfully noted, when we write a paper, when we are assigned with a topic and write a paper, usually the person responsible or the persons responsible would usually start with reviewing relevant, not only academic, but certainly also academic literature, again, to get the widest perspective possible, and then to focus the conversation on kind of the areas that our delegates are most interested in, that our chair is most interested in. So I'm not sure I can provide a kind of the silver bullet that can get your paper in being mentioned in an OECD paper. I need to reflect on that. But you are most welcome to share your outputs with us. I mean, we sometimes, from time to time, get academics sending us articles that they've recently published. And we also always make sure reading them, and in case we are working on something which is relevant, to read them, give them an even deeper reading. So yeah, feel free to reach out to us if you want to get a sense on what are we doing. We have a very active LinkedIn account. We are visible on all social media, but our LinkedIn account, I would say, is particularly active and very, very successful. A great way to follow us. And yeah.
And also your YouTube channel, I think, with invitation of leading voices in the field, it's very, very helpful for those who prefer audiovisual format as well. I think it's really a rich source of information and inspiration. And we have this tradition of closing conversation with recommendations to students. And as you are in the epicenter of this melting pot where different competition cultures interact on continuous basis, so you see the trend, you sense the trend, you shape the trend. What would be your recommendation to those who just at the beginning of their journey? Maybe they have to train specific part of their research or policymaking identity. Maybe some aspects are missing currently or in the greater demand than other must-haves.
Well, if we have junior students watching us and they haven't decided yet to focus on competition, they can advise them, focus on competition. It's fascinating. You will not regret it. For those of our viewers who already made this very good decision, you know, there are many different aspects, just to be honest, of competition work. We in the OECD, we focus mostly on policy and to some extent on enforcement, but we don't do enforcement. So if you are an enforcer, if you like to have a case waiting for you on your desk every morning, then maybe the OECD is not necessarily the place for you. But if you want to get the wider perspective, if you want to understand that not only competition, but the context in which competition is working and how to effectively promote competition policy in the wider policy environment, and the OECD is definitely the place for you.
Ori Schwartz, thank you very much for sharing your great ideas with all of us.
Thank you very, very much for having me. It was a great pleasure.